Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mobbin coming at you with another APGov video. This is our fourth video focusing in on topic 4.10, ideology and social policy. Now previously we've taken a look at a lot of policies mostly affected to addressing issues of poverty, healthcare, etc. Today we're going to be taking a look at a couple of other themes that do relate to economic and social welfare policy, and one of those areas is labor. Now when we talk about labor, we're talking about folks that are members of unions. Usually these are in blue-collar jobs like manufacturing, although it could be in white-collar service jobs like, say, teaching. We do see ideology play a role generally in the overall level of support for unionization. Conservatives generally are opposed to labor unions. Why? Well, the idea being is that unions tend to kind of, mess with the traditional principles of the free market. That, in other words, the free market should dictate what labor is worth, whereas unions force a negotiation to determine that worth, and that is viewed by some conservatives as an artificial valuation of that labor. Liberals tend to support unions because of the the belief that unions have played a critical role in protecting workplace conditions, protecting quality pay, benefits, things like that for working class Americans. But note, the vast majority of Americans, believe that unions should have a right to exist. And that right to exist as a union stems from the New Deal era law of the Wagner Act. Prior to the Wagner Act, it was very common for federal courts to place injunctions on labor unions to prevent them from striking, like in the case of the 1894 Pullman strike. And so what the Wagner Act does is legitimize unions as something that have a right to exist. And note, unions have played a role in lobbying government to create policies to help working class Americans, such as the minimum wage, and also overtime pay. Overtime pay is something that is not just, a nicety of your employer. That's mandated by law if you work over 40 hours and you are a wage earner as opposed to salary earner. Now, that being said, though, unions, have received some backlash. As we go through the 1930s and 40s, which in many respects was kind of the high watermark of unionization in America. In the 1940s, for example, 1 in 3 Americans were in labor unions. Now, of course, this is also at the height of the American economy being based on manufacturing. But as World War II ends, we start to see a little bit of a pushback, and in many respects, that's embodied in what's known as the Taft-Hartley Act. What this does is assert the right for states to ban what are known as closed shops. So what is a closed shop? A closed shop is a business that does not require union membership, whereas an open shop, in contrast, is a business that has, because of the power of the union, has negotiated a contract with the ownership to mandate that anybody that works at that company must join the union. For example, Kroger is an open shop. If you want to work at Kroger, you have to join the union. Now, the argument for an open shop, the argument for a closed shop, let me go back. A closed shop is where you have to join the union. An open shop is where you don't have to join the union. So I do apologize for any confusion there. Anyway, the argument for a closed shop is to allow workers to be a united front so they don't undercut each other in terms of wages. The argument for an open shop is that it allows people to have a choice as to whether or not they want to join a union. There's more of a sense of individual economic freedom in that regard. And that's why states that have allowed for the banning of closed shops, they tend to call these right-to-work laws, which is, basically the idea being is you don't have to join a union, you have the right to avoid that. And currently right now, 28 states do have right-to-work laws. Ohio is, though, not one of them. Now, we have seen since the 1950s a steady decline in union power in the United States. Part of that is based on the transitioning of the type of economy that we now have. What used to be a blue-collar manufacturing-based economy has now transitioned into mostly a service-based economy with more of a percentage involved in white-collar work. And so we have seen the percentage of Americans in unions go from about 1 in 3 during the 1940s now down to about 1 in 11. Less than 10% of American workers are in unions, and that number is continuing to decline. And evidence of that waning influence and power of labor unions was seen in 1981 when, in a dispute with air traffic controllers, the air traffic controllers went on strike. Now, note, these are folks that are government employees as air traffic controllers, employed by the FAA. Reagan threatened that if these folks go on strike, it would cripple the U.S. economy, it would cripple U.S. transportation, and therefore he told the workers, you cannot go on strike. The workers called, the air traffic controllers called Reagan's bluff, and Reagan fired them. He fired any striking air traffic controller, and they were replaced. Now, note, by this point in time, in the 1980s, we're seeing this as part of a conservative revolution happening politically. Would this have, could you have gotten away with this, 40 years earlier? Probably not. But that shows you that growing strength in terms of standing up to unions and correspondingly waning influence. Now, that's not to say that unions are obsolete. That's not to say that unions don't serve a purpose anymore. They certainly do. They do work to try to protect the rights of workers. They still do have some political muscle, especially in the Democratic Party. But they're not what they used to be. That is true. To round it out, we want to take a look at some ideological differences when it comes to social policy involving privacy. Generally, when it comes to privacy, liberals believe that the government should kind of stay out of that. In other words, if it's matters of your own personal body as a woman, or who your sexual partners are, those kinds of things are designed to be private decisions, and therefore liberals believe that the government should really stay out of that. Conservatives, however, when it comes to social issues, have a belief that the government has a responsibility to protect what would be viewed as quote-unquote traditional values. That, in other words, there are certain traditional social values and norms that have allowed the United States to become a successful, stable country. And if those values are eroded or chipped away or broken, then what we have achieved would collapse. And therefore, because of the significance of this, conservatives believe that the government needs to have a role in maintaining those traditional values. So, what does this kind of look like? Well, it's more of an idea of, okay, if you want to have an abortion as a woman, that's, your private right as far as a liberal is concerned. From a conservative perspective, having that abortion generally is viewed as an act of murder. That goes against, the traditional value of protecting human life. If you are talking about, the marrying of someone of the same sex, liberals argue that's your right. You should be able to marry and cohabitate with anybody that is another consenting adult. Whereas conservatives argue no. Marriage, for example, is defined traditionally as between one man and one woman. There's tons of cultural history, if not religious, foundation for defining this across generations, across cultures, etc., etc. So it should not be protected by the government. Now, note, a lot of this is dividing us ideologically, but also simultaneously, by state. Now, because of the federal system that we operate under, many of these things are not decided by the federal government, but rather on a state-by-state basis. And depending on the ideological lean, the prevailing ideological lean of that state, that can affect what the prevailing policies are regarding matters of privacy. For example, if you're talking about, the use of public restrooms for people that identify as transgender, you've got in more liberal-leaning states specific protections for that, saying that you cannot deny someone access to a public restroom based on the gender that they identify with. Whereas in other states, more conservative states, those protections do not exist. Therefore, businesses and local governments can specifically put in rules that only allow people to use public restrooms based on the gender that they are born with, not what they identify as. Many of these issues are also, tied to, as I was kind of mentioning, religious sentiment and, the protected right to practice one's faith, the free exercise clause. And this has led to some very interesting questions. Like, for example, can you be or should you be forced to engage in a type of activity, let's say a commercial activity, business activity, even if it violates your religious values? Right now, the Supreme Court just recently has decided to take on a case that they're going to hear next year that is focusing in on a Colorado company that specializes on creating web designs, websites for couples that are getting engaged to get married. Now, one of the customers for this site was a gay couple, and they wanted to hire this company to do their web design. And the web designer stipulated that because of their Christian values, that it would preclude them from being able to provide that service. In other words, they would be violating their own religious values to, basically design and thereby consent or show some degree of tacit approval for this kind of a union. So that's going to be very interesting, the court hearing this coming up next year. So that's going to really kind of dictate where policy will go. And then lastly, we've mentioned this in previous units, one of the prevailing matters of concern regarding privacy is the ability of the government to collect data on us, metadata, for example. And that is one thing that has generally seen bipartisan concern over. Liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats both tend to be concerned about the amount of data that the government has on us. Conservatives more of a sense of fearing big government. Liberals more of a concern of having personal privacy. But we've seen that. And something else that you do want to kind of keep in mind is that we're talking about the prevailing ideologies, liberals and conservatives. But if you factor in kind of the non-traditional ideologies like libertarians, for example, if you're talking about where do libertarians stand? Well, libertarians tend to stand in support of more liberal views in terms of privacy matters. But if you're talking about economic policy, libertarians tend to side more with conservative values. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and leave it there. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.